Some people have suggested that central banks should try and influence expectations directly by saying what they expect to happen. My view is that that would actually be rather dangerous because you have to have a credible means of making it happen. It's very important for economists to indicate the uncertainty around their projections and, perhaps even more than that, indicate the general framework with which they're produced.
Good evening. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I'm Jagjit Chadha, the Director of the National Institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here today for the fourth event in our Festival of Social Science. This is one I've been particularly looking forward to as someone who's exclusively worked in macroeconomics and macroeconomic policy in his career. I've been someone who's read very widely on both the areas in which Christopher Dow has written on, but also Martin Weale, and I find myself both surprised and honoured to follow in his footsteps as director of this great institute. In fact, we're very welcome as well this evening another previous director of the institute, Andrew Britton, who joins us as well today. This evening we're here to launch our inaugural Dow lecture in macroeconomic policy. Christopher Dow, whose work, as I said earlier on, is one his work that I myself have used frequently. When I first became an academic in the late 1990s, his books on the great recessions, but also on the management of the British economy, were ones that I put on the reading list for students. Getting them to read it, of course, was another matter, but that's always a problem with students. But I think those who did welcomed the chance to understand from a master a description of the British economy in the period immediately after the post-war, but also over the whole of the 20th century. In fact, his very use of the word doldrums about the immediate aftermath of the great crash or recession of the early 1920s is one that I've used frequently to describe the current period that we're living through as well. So some of the ideas resonate through time. Of course, Christopher Dow had himself almost the full house of economic jobs, a period at Treasury, a period at the National Institute, ending as Deputy Director, a long period at the OECD, ending as well with a long period at the Bank of England, ending up as Executive Director, and then returning to the Institute as Visiting Fellow. So I'm delighted that we're able to launch this series of annual lectures and that the Dow family are here this evening to join us in remembering his work, but also looking forward to the challenges of macroeconomic policy. I'm therefore even more pleased to welcome back Martin Weale, who was himself director here from 1995 to 2010. Prior to that, he was a Cambridge man, Clare College, Cambridge, and a lecturer at the Faculty of Economics and Politics. After stepping down from the MPC in 2016, he took up a chair at King's College London, from where he has visited on us this evening. This evening, Martin will talk about, do economists expect too much from expectations? So I think all I need to do at this moment is turn to Martin Weale. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Could I say what an honour it is to be giving the inaugural Dow lecture? When I joined the Institute in 1995, Christopher Dow was working on his final book, Major Recessions, and it's unfortunate that he's not with us to offer his analysis of the Depression, which started in 2008 and in whose shadow we're still living. So I'd like to offer my own welcome here to all of you, but in particular to Christopher's children and grandchildren. It's very kind of you to attend. This evening I'd like to talk to you about expectations in economics and their possible influence on the world, with a focus on expectations of wage and price increases, but also with some discussions of orders, employment and unit costs. Christopher stressed the role of expectations in recessions. He argued that recessions were the results of breaks in confidence. But I can't avoid starting by noting that for much of history, expectations have arisen not from an understanding of either people's behaviour or from an understanding of the natural world. We all know the importance of biblical dreams. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, or the three kings were warned to return home by a different route. But perhaps the most engaging story I know of expectations is that in the Nunna's Priestess tale of the cock and the hen. Chanticleer the cock dreamt that he'd been seized by a fox. His favourite wife, Pertilotte, assured him that the problem was caused by an imbalance of bodily humours. Sure enough, however, his expectations were fulfilled and he escaped death only by the narrowest of margins. Of course, many people might assume that if Chaucer's tale were true, then dreams must have predictive power. But as we all know, a much larger sample would be needed to come to any such conclusion. So why are expectations as important to economists as dreams were in the ancient and medieval worlds? The answer is that a wide range of economic decisions is influenced by expectations. Businesses invest to meet future demand, not current demand, and thus investment has to be influenced by expectations. Consumption, similarly, is likely to be affected to some extent by expectations of people's future circumstances. Wage growth is probably influenced by expected price growth, and the assumption that price increases depend on expected future price increases features many of today's macroeconomic models. The body of my talk will provide an empirical focus on the nature of expectations. Where do they come from? Can they be influenced by policy decisions of the Bank of England? Are they related to subsequent behaviour, and how accurate are they? There are three forms of expectational indicators, I think. The first are forecasts produced by so-called professional forecasters. I've never seen forecasting as a profession. Anyway, these have had plenty of scrutiny, and I don't intend to discuss them further today. Secondly, there are measures of expectations of future interest rates and prices derived from financial markets. These are not the main focus of my talk, but I can't avoid saying something about them. Thirdly, there are measures produced by surveying households or firms, and the bulk of this lecture is prepared from work with three former colleagues from the Bank of England, Lena Boniver, James Cloyne and Thomas Wieladek, and I'm glad to see Thomas here this evening. It's work we did using the Confederation of British Industries Industrial Trends Survey, and we're all very grateful to the CBI for supplying the data in a form which made this work possible. So I'd like to illustrate first the performance of market expectations by looking first at the foreign exchanges and secondly at the forecast for inflation implied in the gilt-edged markets. In its earliest days, the Monetary Policy Committee assumed that the exchange rate would follow the path set out by values in forward markets. In 1999, Sushil Wadhwani argued that the current rate was a better predictor of the future than was the market forward rate. Committees, of course, always compromise, so the Monetary Policy Committee, instead of being persuaded by Sushil's argument, decided to take the average of the two, and that approach certainly continued while I was on the committee, and I think is what is still in force. I did argue sometimes, and rather ineffectively, that perhaps we should revisit the empirical basis for this assumption about expectations, not only with reference to the foreign exchanges, but other market indicators. Now, that never actually happened, but for today, I thought it would be interesting to look and see whether Sushil's conclusion still held. So this graph shows the plot of expected changes against actual changes in the sterling dollar exchange rate going back to from the end of June 1989 to the end of June 2016. Now, okay, there are a lot of red blobs there. What would we expect? Well, if the expectation in financial markets were a good predictor of the outturn, we'd expect to see those red dots scattered around the 45-degree line. What we actually see, of course, is that the red dots are on the vertical line, and that's saying that the expected change derived in the markets tells us nothing about the outturn, and it therefore follows that, just as Sushil found, it's still the case that the current state of the exchange rate is a better indicator of the future than are the dreams observed in the forward market. So that's one variable. What about inflation? Now, the market carries with it implied figures for the rate of inflation because, of course, we have indexed debt as well as ordinary debt, and if you compare the rates of return on the two, you can find an implied figure for the expected value of the movement in the retail price index. Whether that's a good indicator of inflation is something I could talk to you at very great length about, but perhaps for another occasion. Anyway, so how does the gilt-edged market do? If we look at the left-hand chart, there I have plotted the dots from 1985 to 2015. There are some gaps in the data, presumably because there were periods when there weren't suitable indexed stock to make the calculation possible. Now you can see that actually here at least there is a positive slope to the data. Higher expectations are associated with higher outturns, but these blue dots, in my view, can sort of flatter to deceive. It's certainly the case that in the early part of the period, the late 80s, early 90s, inflation was quite a lot higher than it has been. And it's not terribly surprising then that inflation expectations have come down. Supposing we look just at 2011 to 2015 to test our hypothesis that markets tell us about the future. Well, there you can see that those are the red dots showing the combinations of expectations and outturns. Once again, if the market was any good, they should be spread out round the 45-degree line. Actually, you can see that they have a perverse slope. So, I hesitate to recommend the forecasting tool look at the forecast and believe the opposite, but this actually does seem to be what the market is saying. Now, of course, I'm not saying necessarily that anyone except the National Institute and the Monetary Policy Committee could have produced better forecasts or did produce better forecasts, but it does seem to me that we should follow Pertolot's advice and be extremely cautious before rushing to believe things that we see in markets. Well, so much for market signals. Let me now turn to the message from business surveys. And as I said, I would like to draw on the survey conducted by the Confederation of British Industry. Over the years at the National Institute, we did quite a body of work on this. I worked particularly with Sylvia Louis and James Mitchell. One of the findings that I was one of the pieces of work I was particularly proud of was that we looked at what firms told the CBI about their outturn, and we matched those returns to what the same firms said to the Office for National Statistics. Now, that was done in a way that was achieved without us actually knowing who the respondents were. There was a sort of double preservation of anonymity. But what we found was that there was indeed coherence between what people told the CBI and what they told the Office for National Statistics. On the other hand, we also found that what people told the CBI seemed to be influenced by average opinion, or what you could call collective sentiment. People's individual responses depended on the average as well as on their own experience. And that observation actually proved quite useful in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit referendum. Then the Monetary Policy Committee was shown a survey result it wasn't a CBI survey, it was a survey conducted by the Institute of Purchasing Managers that suggested that the economy had contracted very sharply, and I found myself arguing to the committee that we shouldn't believe it we shouldn't pay too much attention to it because it was probably contaminated by collective sentiment. Well, with the hindsight that we have now, that turned out to be the case. Perhaps that was just an example of being lucky, but nevertheless, it was one of the benefits that came from having worked on the CBI data. Now, historically, the CBI survey goes back to 1959, but it only asked questions which expected qualitative answers. What's happened to the volume of new orders, or what's happened to employment, and the response was up, no change, or down. And obviously a survey like that is very attractive because it's easy and quick for people to answer, and in a pre-computer age it's also easy and quick to compile the results. But in 2008 the CBI started asking businesses about expected price and wage changes and asking for what were in effect quantitative answers. How much did your own prices go up over the last 12 months? How much do you expect them to go up by over the next 12 months? They asked the same question for wages. Well, when I say they invited numerical answers, they actually asked firms to tick boxes, so you could choose 0, you could choose 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, things like that. But essentially businesses were putting quantitative responses round what they said. And it's those data that created a lot of new opportunities for work. So in the work that I'm describing now here, we looked at 3 questions which expected quantitative answers about prices, wages, and also the so-called rate of operation. How full to capacity are you? We also looked at 3 questions which solicit qualitative answers about past and expected future movements. Those concerned new orders, the volume of employment, and costs per unit of output. Now, running surveys is all very well, but for the CBI and many people collecting data, it's actually rather difficult because you rely on people's goodwill to respond, and sometimes they do respond and sometimes they don't. So the CBI goes to about 1,000 firms in each quarter. Because its aim is to produce quick answers, it doesn't have much incentive to go back to people who have been slow at replying, because if they're slow, they tend to miss the deadline. So we have what in principle should be a survey of the same firms from one quarter to the next, but actually there's quite rapid rotation, and you find that some firms drop out and then come in again, and maybe then they drop out again. It's a survey which is, probably the best one can do for that sort of survey, but not an ideal tool for the sort of econometric analysis that people like me get excited by. Anyway, how do these data compare with official statistics? So in the left-hand chart, I show measures of past and expected future price growth. The solid red line shows the average of the responses on expected future price growth. The dotted line shows the average of responses about past price growth. And then I have 2 price indices. The one with the dots shows inflation as measured by the consumer price index, and the second line shows inflation as measured by the output price index. And I suppose I felt that, looking at these, I can persuade myself, first of all, that the expectations do anticipate the outcomes, at least in points like that. Secondly, possibly in very broad terms, they're consistent with the movement of output prices, but you can see that in that period when unit costs, or when costs, particularly oil prices and commodities, were very volatile, it's not clear that that's the case. If we look at wages, then perhaps it's a bit clearer to see expectations lagging outcomes, but the CBI series isn't as volatile as the series average weekly earnings that the Office for National Statistics produces, and that may in part be because the Office for National Statistics index, at least that we've shown there, includes bonuses, whereas in responding to the CBI survey, people may have been taking out the influence of bonuses. In any case, bonuses are mainly paid in the financial services industry, and the CBI survey is a survey of firms in manufacturing. What do the data look like if instead I plot them in distribution? The left-hand chart here shows as a histogram the density of expected price increases. And you can see that there seems to be a sort of curve that you can trace out, but over about a third of people say no change. And is that just because in responding to surveys, people often say zero if you ask them to give a number, or is it because actually they aren't going to change their prices? If you relate this to economic theory, which suggests that people will change prices only relatively infrequently, that implies that we should expect just under 15% of firms not to change prices in a 12-month period, and this is a number something like twice that. So maybe some people are responding zero when they don't mean zero, but we have the data that we do. The other thing you can see is that although there are some people expecting to make price cuts, they're very much skewed to the positive half of the chart. Price increases, even during this period from 2008 to 2016, when many people were worried about deflation, price increases were expected to be much more common than price decreases. If I look at wages, I see much the same sort of thing. Here, the range of buckets is lower than those offered for price increases. You can see that there's quite a lot of stickiness shown at zero, and we do find in general that there is wage stickiness at zero. Forcing through wage reductions is not always very easy, to say the least. Not a minute on the day, not a penny off the pay. That's a slogan that still resonates after 100 years. So very few expected to be cutting pay. A peak at zero, and underneath that, again, you can see a distribution. What about the qualitative data? Well, the left-hand chart shows the expectation of new orders in red and the experience, the subsequent outcome in dotted red lines. And again, I can persuade myself that at least some of the peaks and troughs in the dotted red line lag the expected line. The connection with actual output movement isn't terribly strong. And I think the same is true if we look at employment, that actual growth in employment is quite erratic in manufacturing. Sometimes it tracks the CBI survey quite well, and in other periods it doesn't. Unit costs, well, here, we do find that there's more marching in step with the official data. At the beginning of the period, unit costs were rising, they were expected to rise, and no, that was what firms said to the CBI. Late in the period, no, there was an increase, unit costs again were expected to rise, and they were rising. Finally, let me turn to the rate of operation, capacity utilisation. Here I've plotted that with unemployment. That's the unemployment rate in the whole economy. Now, looking at data, it's easy to filter out the observations you don't want to see, and in broad terms, perhaps there's an upward drift in the rate of operation at the same time as the unemployment rate is coming down. But this certainly suggests to me that using unemployment as a proxy for spare capacity, which a lot of economists do, is perhaps not the best way of going about things. Let me say a bit more about expectations and outturns. What we find if we look at expected price growth and expected wage growth is that they're less volatile than the subsequent outturns. And that's not terribly surprising. Things happen, people have shocks, and those can't be taken account of in expectations. Similarly, if we look at orders, employment and costs, this table, I'm sorry these numbers have proven rather small, I shouldn't have tried to fit so much on one slide. This table shows the proportion of people expecting a fall, no change, or a rise, or having experienced a fall, no change, or a rise. And you can see that more people expected no change than experienced no change. And once again, that is a consequence of surprises being what happens to you. Outturns, by their nature, are more volatile than expectations. So how are these series interrelated? In this table, which I'm glad to say is a bit more visible, I show correlations between the movements in the different variables. And you can see that expectations are quite influenced by past events. So expected price growth has a correlation of nearly 0.6 with past price growth. Expected wage growth has a correlation of 0.53 with past price growth. Expected orders growth is correlated 0.47 with expected employment. It's also correlated with past employment growth and with past orders growth. Expected orders growth is correlated with past orders growth. Past employment is correlated with past orders growth. So it's reassuring to see a connection between employment and orders. I should also say that expected price movements are correlated with expected cost movements. Past price movement, I can't see a strong correlation with past cost growth. Well, it's 0.28, which is material, but perhaps not large enough to merit being shown in red on this chart. So what doesn't this show us? It shows us costs, expected costs moving in line with past costs, expected prices moving in line with past prices. What it doesn't show is any strong evidence of a connection between price movements and the rate of operation or the rate or the growth of demand. So if we want to look for a simple economic model here, try and find evidence for that, I don't think we can find it. Now, that's not to say that prices are insensitive to demand, but I think we shouldn't expect to see strong influences, and they, I think, are often very difficult to detect. What determines people's expectations? Here I look first at prices and then I look at wages. And these results are obviously closely related to the correlations table, but here what I've done is correct for firm fixed effects. So you may have one firm which always gave high results for prices and or for future price movements and high results for past price movements. That would influence the correlation, but here it would be taken out by a fixed effect. And here we see more strongly expected price movements are influenced by import price growth and also by past costs, whether they rose or were unchanged. And here we do find some evidence for the rate of operation, but I must say not terribly powerful evidence. If we look at wage growth, we can see that expected wage growth seems to be influenced by the GDP forecast that the Monetary Policy Committee produces, also by past orders movements, past employment going up, and the rate of operation. So here perhaps we see a bit of evidence that the labour market is functioning in the way you might expect, that if demand in the labour market is tight, if a firm is wanting to increase employment, then it does expect or has been increasing employment, then that gets it into the habit of thinking that wages will go up. And if past orders have risen and it's worrying about how to give effect to those, then it does start to expect wages to go up. So here we see a bit of some evidence for a functioning labour market, rather less for functioning, for demand functioning in the goods market. Does policy influence expectations? Well, this chart shows announcements about unconventional policy and measures of expected price increases as reported in the CBI survey. And if you look at this chart, which shows the raw data, then there perhaps isn't very much influence. If you look at change at QE asset holdings, if you look at changes in asset holdings, then perhaps you can find slightly more evidence. And certainly, we did produce, with the same colleagues but in a different paper, we did produce some evidence suggesting that monetary policy announcements of unconventional policy, or at least quantitative easing and funding for lending, not forward guidance, did influence producers' expectations of price movements and wage movements. So that might suggest that policy does work partly through an expectational framework. On the other hand, Thomas and I did some other work which looked at the actual effects of quantitative easing, and the coefficients shown here for the impact of the policy on expected prices and wages are much greater than we found subsequently on actual prices and wages. Whether the policy did actually have that effect or whether I need to shelter behind the numbers being uncertain, as they always are, I'm not terribly sure, but in putting this talk together, that's a juxtaposition which did start to worry me. What about qualitative expectational data? Well, here we see that new orders are influenced by negatively by wage growth. Here, a value less than 1 means that an increase in wage growth reduces the probability that someone will report a rise in new orders, but they're very strongly influenced by past experience of orders. Employment is influenced positively by past orders, even if people say that they haven't changed. That's more helpful than a negative influence. And employment is also influenced by past price growth. If I look at unit costs, well, perhaps it's reassuring to see that they're influenced by import price growth, but they're also influenced by past experience. So this pattern seems to stress the idea that past experience influences people's outcomes. That may be a large part of where expectations come from, and they are, with these qualitative variables, they aren't significantly sensitive to the forecasts that the Bank of England is producing. Now, I mentioned earlier that an important part of modern macroeconomic theory relies on the idea that price movements depend on expected price movements. Now, you might say, isn't that putting it back to front? Wasn't I just saying that expected price movements depended on actual price movements? And that may also be true. There, you can adjust the timing to check whether there is a relationship this way round as well as the other way round. And in the sort of dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models that are now widely used in banks like central banks like the Bank of England, the underlying assumption is that there's a coefficient of slightly more than 1 linking expected price increases to actual price increases. On quarterly data, perhaps 1.01, something like that. So we looked at that. You can never answer a question quite as well as you would like, but with this data set, we were able to control for firm fixed effects, firm and time fixed effects, firm, time and sector fixed effects. Then we also looked at firm effects with controls for the nature of the firm, and firm and time effects with controls. And you can see if I look at prices, I get a coefficient of about 0.3. If I look at wages, I also get a coefficient of about 0.3. These are statistically significant. They're different from 0, which is perhaps good news for economic theory, but they're also statistically significantly very different from 1, which is bad news for economic theory. So perhaps this does identify an area where theory has run ahead of fact, and I'm afraid I'm not able to come up with an alternative model that would work better, but at least it's something to worry about when one looks at forecasts and interprets them. Finally, let me look at the issue of how expectations relate to outcome. So whereas before I was saying were outcomes influenced by past expectations, here I'm comparing the outcome for 12 months ahead with what people had said would happen 12 months ago. And if I look at that, I can do it in 2 ways. In the first set of columns, I've got macro forecast errors. These are the errors in the Monetary Policy Committee's inflation forecast and growth forecast. And if I look at prices, I can see that when the MPC got things wrong, so did firms. That may say that the MPC was leading the firms up the garden path, although a much kinder interpretation, and one that I would prefer, was that both were affected by the same events. Surprises happen, and the MPC couldn't know what was going to come, and neither could the firms producing these forecasts. So you can see they're explained by those forecast errors, but what we also see here is a strong negative coefficient. And that says that those firms which produced very high forecasts of price increases subsequently realised much lower numbers. Conversely, those firms which produced very low numbers subsequently realised much higher ones. So the extremes of expectations proved to be wrong with hindsight. With wages, the same is true. You can see there's a strongly negative coefficient. if I put in time effects instead of the macro forecasts, then you can also see that there were influences from past price increases. So people who had reported past price increases tended to have expectations which outran the outturns. In other words, past experience was one of the reasons why people were giving the wrong expectations. The same is true with wages. And if you want to believe in what is a popular economist's assumption, rational expectations, i.e. that expectations are on average correct, then you can do a statistical test. The number in that column has to be lower than 15.15 for the hypothesis that expectations are rational, this framework beloved by economists to be supported by the data, and a number like 500 is, to my mind, quite a lot above 15.15. So these data firmly reject the idea that businesses' expectations are rational. Let me wind up by talking about the qualitative data. Now, you can't do the same tests for rationality with the qualitative data, but what we can do is separate the people who forecast rises from the people who forecast falls, and of the people who forecast rises, we might want at least half of them to have experienced rises. Then you would say that the median forecaster was right. The individual firms weren't all right, but the median one was. The blue line shows the proportion who experienced a rise given that they forecast a rise. Now that's an uncertain proportion because the data are prone to sampling error. So the dotted red line shows a 95% confidence limit. And you can see, looking at this variable, unit costs, I think there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there were 10 occasions when when the proportion who experienced rises was much lower than you would have expected given the proportion who forecast rises. You find that actually there are some periods when both those forecasting falls got it wrong, and those forecasting rises got it wrong. In other words, there were extremes in both categories at the same time. With employment, you find much weaker evidence for rejecting rationality, and the explanation may be that employment is something firms have under their control, whereas costs are not something they have under their control. Orders are between employment and costs. You reject rationality, but not as clearly as you do with costs. So where does this leave me? Well, I certainly won't change my mind about expectations being important. They are very important, but I must say I don't think we understand them as well as economists would like to. And in particular, when people get terribly exercised about some data, whether stock market data or something else, telling us that people are expecting some disaster, all I can do is repeat Pertilot's advice to her husband, for God's love, us tuck some laxatif. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's absolutely fascinating. Look through some of the surprises and expectations of the UK data. I've learnt a hell of a lot. We have time for some questions. Perhaps I could just start with the first one. Were you surprised to learn that forward guidance didn't have much of an impact in your results?
Well, I suppose, as people may remember, I voted against the policy. That was because I was worried that it would have an impact rather than that it didn't have an impact. I was worried that it would, given the way it was specified, it would suggest that the Monetary Policy Committee was losing sight of the inflation target.
I see.
So I suppose if I'd thought it would have no effect, then I might as well have voted for it, because it would have been a costless vote.
The whole thing is predicated on the people filling in CBI surveys themselves being rational and thoughtful. Now, I used to run quite a large firm and never knew who in the firm filled in the forms. And so I'm really quite skeptical about the raw material for this kind of study. And I know that it then goes on into the newspapers, into the MPC and the rest. But I'm reminded of GIGO. Garbage in and garbage out.
Could I respond to that by repeating my reference to the work that was done at the National Institute, where we did take the responses that firms had given to the CBI on the output question, up, no change, or down, and we related that to what the same firms told the Office for National Statistics. Now, of course, they could have been telling the Office for National Statistics poppycock, as well as telling the ONS as well as telling the CBI poppycock, but at least it was consistent poppycock, and that, to my mind, gives it, is a reason for having confidence in those data. I mean, at the same time, I would say I'm sure none of the journalists here, but a lot of journalists do give much too great importance to these data. They're an indicator, they're perhaps the best indicator that you can produce in the time available, but they don't have the standing of official statistics, they don't have the standing of data that have been refined over time, and they don't have the standing of data which you can actually follow up when people give surprising responses. And a large part of what the ONS has to do is check up on answers when the numbers look rather surprising.
I was just wondering, what role do you think the don't know responses should play in this? I was quite struck that recent Bank of England work on their own household inflation expectations found about 40% of respondents replied don't know, and that you also have a very high level of uncertainty around the answer. Now, CBI surveys seem to imply everybody responding gives an answer, or the don't knows are just excluded, and you have no uncertainty around the answers. Should you have an uncertainty measure, and should you do something with large numbers of don't knows or changes in the numbers of don't knows?
My memory from the work we did at the National Institute was that there were a rather small proportion of don't knows. I think a number like 1 or 2%. And so in the work that we did, which followed from that at the Bank of England, we simply excluded them. Now, should one give confidence intervals round them? Well, of course, but the main source of uncertainty, I think, comes not because of don't knows. It comes because it's a sample survey with a sample of 1,000, and we know that in surveys like that there is material uncertainty around the proportions.
We were looking at a lot of real economy expectations. I kind of wonder if you've looked at people's expectations of bank rate. Do we have the same disconnect in people's understanding of what the Monetary Policy Committee might do as when people are forming expectations about the real economy?
Now, my memory of surveys that the Bank of England conducted is that a relatively small proportion of the population actually knows about the Monetary Policy Committee and what it does. I mean, that may be a sort of false memory that I increasingly suffer from. But I think, if that is the case, then I think the issue is probably very basic. A lot of people, you will find, don't know who actually sets interest rates.
Okay. Looking at your data, you've got nothing post for Brexit referendum, is that correct?
We go up to 2016 Q3.
Yeah, because I would have thought if you were looking at expectations and things, that was the mother of all shocks and would sort of probably produce quite a lot of information content if you could go on. The other question is, reflects my background sort of as time series modeller. Are you saying that most people's expectations are sort of backward looking, that people are assuming things are a random walk from where we are today? Is that the sort of model of expectation formation that's coming out?
I mean, on the first issue, why didn't we go beyond 2016?
Because you didn't have a staff, presumably.
I mean, partly that this work has gone through the process of trying to get an article published, and that takes its time. Certainly it would be interesting to do this exercise on more recent data. Am I saying that expectations are backward looking? Well, this work does show a strong element of adaptive expectations. I mean, I suppose if you look at them over the long run, if you think of the chart I drew for expected and actual inflation, then you do find that high inflation periods are different from low inflation periods, and that may be something different from adaptive expectations. But yes, I think I am finding quite a drag from past experience on expectations. Now, of course, some people have produced, Paul Levine, for example, several years ago produced a model of learning, and he suggested this was fitted to the United States economy, and he suggested that that performed better than a model which assumed expectations were rational. Now, models of learning, you have to learn from past experience, so in some sense this is consistent with that work.
You haven't said very much about the weight that the Monetary Policy Committee gives or gave to the results of this particular survey. We know the Monetary Policy Committee does another survey of professional forecasters because it includes an account of the results of that survey in the inflation report, and the bank was kind enough to let my research group have access to those data for quite a few, and we got about 5 published articles out of it. We were never sure to what extent the different surveys that the bank was using were actually given much weight by the MPC, and I'd be curious to hear you tell us about that.
No, of course the MPC consists of people who reach individual decisions, and we then managed to, well, I wouldn't say we necessarily managed to agree on a consensus. What the committee does, we is a past habit. When I was agreeing to something, I was agreeing to what I thought represented the average opinion of the MPC rather than rather than agreeing to something because it was my view. And there is, I think, quite a material difference between those two. So I certainly didn't feel that I was bound to defend the collective judgment of the MPC. Now, how much weight the different members of the MPC gave to professional forecasts, they gave to survey data and so on, I suspect that it varied from one period to another, and from one individual to another. There'd be some people who would have strong views on what was going to happen. There would be others who perhaps wanted to give wanted their own opinions to be informed by other people's opinions. And it's not surprising that on a committee consisting of a number of people, you would have a range of views. That arguably is the purpose of a committee. So I'm afraid that's been a bit evasive. There isn't any clear answer to your question. I think it differed from one forecast to the next, and also from one individual to another.
As you were speaking, Martin, I was thinking a bit about Christopher Dow's work on recessions and thinking about the role that expectations have in the way in which recessions begin, but perhaps more importantly in the way that they become embedded, and that because thinking of the Keynesian analysis of the interwar recession, whether there was possible using actual information on expectations to say anything about the origin and perpetuation of the recession that has of course, hit us since Christopher's time.
I mean, the answer to that question has to be, I'm afraid I don't know. It would be, no, that is a sort of gap in the work that I've done, because one aspect of it was completed while I was still at the Institute, and the data we had, I think, expired in 2006 or something like that. The work that we did at the Bank of England, we were particularly interested in the interrelationship of wage and price expectations and outcomes, and that data series started in 2008, and the qualitative data in that data set only started in 2011. Now, I'm pretty confident that the CBI does have the relevant data, and that's something that it would be possible to explore. And indeed, I suppose, given the importance of Christopher's final book, it's a pity that I wasn't able to discuss that at this lecture this evening.
Martin, I'd like to thank you very much. I'm Christopher Dow's son, and Christopher had 4 children, so we're all here, and a number of grandchildren, many actually, of whom several are here, including 2 who I'm proud to say are continuing his tradition of government service. This room also, I would add, is quite special to us because our parents met here, or actually in the anteroom. Martin, I'd like to thank you very much. I'm not sure that I'm going to take your final advice, but as I am an economist, I'm going to rush away, download your paper, and I was talking to my students recently about exchange rate forecasting, so I can update my slides on that. And so on behalf of the Institute, I guess, or certainly our family, I'd like to thank you very much. And the Institute has asked me to present you with a medal which commemorates the fact that you've kindly given the first lecture in this series. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This really is a very great and totally unexpected honour, but I hope you found the evening interesting. Thank you.